Can one day change everything? Step into the life of Sarah, a devoted nurse, whose world turns upside down with an unexpected request from her wealthy, ailing patient, Mrs. Donovan. When the elderly millionaire asks Sarah to pretend to be her estranged daughter for just one day, an extraordinary journey of love, regret, and redemption begins. Sarah Fletcher had always known her job as a nurse would involve more than just medical care. Still, she never expected it to lead her into the role she was about to play. As she pushed the door open to Mrs. Donovan's lavish room, the familiar scent of lavender greeted her, mingling with the sterile smell of the hospital. The room was more luxurious than most, a testament to Mrs. Donovan's wealth, but it also carried a sense of loneliness that seemed to linger in the air. "Good morning, Mrs. Donovan," Sarah said, her voice cheerful as she wheeled in the breakfast cart. The elderly woman, sitting up in bed with a pale face and tired eyes, looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her pause. "Good morning, Sarah," Mrs. Donovan replied, her voice soft but clear. "Could you sit with me for a moment?" Sarah smiled, nodding as she set the tray on the bedside table. She pulled up a chair, her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Donovan wasn't usually one for company, preferring to keep her thoughts to herself. "I've been thinking a lot about my daughter," Mrs. Donovan began, her gaze drifting to the window where the morning sun cast a gentle glow. "Emily. She hasn't visited in years." Sarah knew about Emily. The hospital staff whispered about the strained relationship between the elderly millionaire and her estranged daughter. Mrs. Donovan never spoke much about her, but her eyes would often linger on the photos that adorned her room, pictures of a young girl growing up, snapshots of happier times. "She must be busy," Sarah offered gently, unsure of what else to say. Mrs. Donovan sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. "Busy? Yes, perhaps. Or maybe she's still angry. I made so many mistakes, Sarah. So many things I wish I could undo." Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on Mrs. Donovan's frail one. "We all have regrets, Mrs. Donovan. But it's never too late to make amends." The elderly woman turned her gaze back to Sarah, her eyes suddenly sharp and intent. "That's why I need to ask you something. Something unusual." Sarah's curiosity turned to apprehension, but she nodded. "Of course. What is it?" "Sarah, could you pretend to be my daughter for just one day?" Mrs. Donovan's voice trembled with the weight of her request. "Just for today. I need to feel that connection, to hear her voice, even if it's not real." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She stared at Mrs. Donovan, searching for the right response. "Pretend to be Emily?" "But, Mrs. Donovan." "Please, Sarah," Mrs. Donovan interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "I know it's a lot to ask. But I'm running out of time, and I need this. Just one day." Sarah looked at the elderly woman, her heart aching at the sight of her vulnerability. Mrs. Donovan had always seemed so strong, so composed, despite her illness. Now, she was just a mother longing for her daughter's presence. After a long pause, Sarah nodded. "Okay, Mrs. Donovan. I'll do it. For you." The relief that washed over Mrs. Donovan's face was immediate. She clasped Sarah's hand tightly, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the day ahead. She had no idea how to pretend to be someone's daughter, especially someone she had never met. But for Mrs. Donovan, she would try. The transformation began with small steps. Mrs. Donovan insisted on helping Sarah understand who Emily was, guiding her through old photo albums and recounting stories from Emily's childhood. "Emily loved the swings," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice soft as she pointed to a picture of a young girl with wind-blown hair and a wide smile. "She could spend hours at the park, just swinging back and forth. I used to sit on that bench over there and watch her, feeling so proud." Sarah listened intently, absorbing every detail. The more she learned about Emily, the more she realized how much love and regret Mrs. Donovan held for her daughter. As the morning sun climbed higher, Mrs. Donovan's room began to fill with memories. The photo albums sprawled across the bed, each picture a glimpse into a life Sarah could only imagine. She saw Emily grow up through those photos, a shy little girl, a rebellious teenager, and finally a young woman with a determined gaze. "What happened between you two?" Sarah asked gently, sensing the unspoken pain. Mrs. Donovan sighed, closing one of the albums. "Life happened. Choices were made, and we drifted apart. I was too focused on my business, on building a legacy. Emily wanted something different, something simpler. We argued, and she left. I thought she'd come back eventually, but..." Her voice trailed off, the weight of years of separation hanging in the air. Sarah reached out, squeezing Mrs. Donovan's hand. "I'm sure she still loves you, Mrs. Donovan. Sometimes, we just need a reason to come back." The elderly woman nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "I hope so, Sarah. I really do." As the day progressed, Sarah stepped deeper into her role as Emily. She found herself responding to Mrs. Donovan's stories with genuine interest, asking questions that the real Emily might have asked. "Tell me about your favorite vacation," Sarah said during lunch, her voice soft and curious. Mrs. Donovan's eyes sparkled with the memory. "We went to Italy when Emily was 10. It was magical. The food, the sights, everything was perfect. Emily was fascinated by the history, the art. She kept a journal, drawing pictures and writing about everything we saw." Sarah smiled, imagining a young Emily, notebook in hand, exploring the ancient streets of Rome. "She sounds like she was very creative." "She was," Mrs. Donovan agreed, her voice tinged with pride. "I still have that journal somewhere. It's one of my most treasured possessions." The afternoon passed in a haze of memories and shared stories. Sarah found herself becoming more comfortable in her role, her heart warming to Mrs. Donovan's tales. She realized that this day was not just a gift for Mrs. Donovan but for herself as well. It was a reminder of the power of human connection, of the importance of family. By evening, the room was filled with a quiet, peaceful atmosphere. The sun had set, and the soft glow of a lamp illuminated the space. Sarah sat beside Mrs. Donovan, holding her hand as they watched old home videos. The flickering images on the screen showed a young Emily, laughing and playing, her joy infectious. "Thank you, Sarah," Mrs. Donovan said softly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Today has been the best day I've had in years." Sarah squeezed her hand, feeling a lump form in her throat. "It's been my pleasure, Mrs. Donovan." As the video played on, showing scenes of a happy family, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had given Mrs. Donovan the gift of a day with her daughter, and in return, she had received a deeper understanding of love and forgiveness. The night grew darker, and Mrs. Donovan's eyes grew heavy. Sarah stayed by her side until she drifted off to sleep, her heart full. As she left the room, Sarah glanced back at the peaceful figure in the bed. She knew this day would stay with her forever, a reminder of the impact one day of kindness could have. And as she walked down the silent corridor, she whispered a silent promise to herself, to always cherish the connections that mattered most. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains of Mrs. Donovan's room, casting a warm glow on the walls adorned with framed memories. Sarah arrived early, her heart still heavy with the promise she had made the previous day. She stood for a moment at the door, gathering her thoughts, before knocking softly and entering. "Good morning, Emily," Mrs. Donovan greeted her, a tender smile lifting the corners of her lips. Sarah returned the smile, the name feeling strange yet comforting. "Good morning, Mom," Sarah replied, stepping fully into the role she had agreed to play. She walked over to the bedside and took Mrs. Donovan's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," Mrs. Donovan said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Knowing you're here, it means the world to me." Sarah nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. She glanced around the room, noting the photo albums still spread out from the day before. Why don't we start our day with some breakfast? Then we can go through more of these albums together." Mrs. Donovan's face brightened at the suggestion. "That sounds wonderful. You always knew how to make the simplest moments special." As Sarah prepared the breakfast tray, she found herself slipping more comfortably into the role of Emily. She brought over a cup of tea and a plate of toast, sitting beside Mrs. Donovan as they began their meal. "You remember how much you loved strawberry jam?" Mrs. Donovan asked, her eyes twinkling with nostalgia. "I used to spread it on your toast every morning before school." Sarah smiled, playing along. "I do remember. It was always my favorite part of breakfast." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of birds chirping outside the only noise in the room. After breakfast, Sarah helped Mrs. Donovan back into her chair by the window, arranging the pillows for her comfort. "Would you like to go through more of the photo albums?" Sarah asked, picking up one from the bedside table. "Yes, please," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice filled with anticipation. "I want to share as many memories with you as I can." Sarah opened the album, revealing pictures from various family vacations. The photos were a mix of candid moments and posed shots, each one capturing a slice of life that had once been filled with joy and laughter. "This one was from our trip to the Grand Canyon," Mrs. Donovan said, pointing to a photo of a younger Emily standing at the edge of the vast landscape, her arms spread wide as if embracing the world. "You were so fearless back then. Always ready for an adventure." Sarah traced the outline of Emily's face in the photo, imagining the girl's excitement and wonder. "It must have been an incredible trip." "It was," Mrs. Donovan replied, her voice softening. "You kept a rock from the canyon as a souvenir. Do you still have it?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I do. It's on my bookshelf at home." Mrs. Donovan's eyes filled with tears again, and she reached out to touch Sarah's hand. "Thank you for keeping those memories alive." They continued through the album, each page bringing new stories and recollections. As the morning turned into afternoon, Sarah found herself becoming more and more immersed in the world of Emily. She listened to Mrs. Donovan's stories with genuine interest, asking questions and prompting more memories. "Tell me about Dad," Sarah said softly, sensing the importance of this subject. Mrs. Donovan's face softened at the mention of her late husband. "He was a wonderful man. Kind, patient, and always supportive. He adored you, you know. You were the apple of his eye." Sarah nodded, feeling a pang of sadness for the family she had never known but was coming to care about deeply. "I wish I remembered him better." "He's with us in spirit," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "And he'd be so proud of the woman you've become." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of the past and the reality of the present blending into a poignant stillness. Sarah felt a deep connection forming between her and Mrs. Donovan, a bond that transcended the roles they were playing. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Mrs. Donovan took another walk in the hospital garden. The flowers were in full bloom, and the scent of roses filled the air. They found a bench near the fountain and sat together, enjoying the peaceful surroundings. "Emily," Mrs. Donovan said after a long silence, "I want you to know that I've made peace with my past. I've come to terms with my mistakes, and I've found a way to forgive myself. But I need to know that you can forgive me too." Sarah looked at Mrs. Donovan, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. "I forgive you, Mom. I really do. We can't change the past, but we can make the most of the time we have now." Mrs. Donovan's face softened, a look of relief washing over her. "Thank you, Emily. That means the world to me." They sat in silence for a while, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that she was helping Mrs. Donovan find peace and closure. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, they made their way back to Mrs. Donovan's room. Sarah helped her into bed, making sure she was comfortable. "Would you like to watch some old home videos?" Sarah suggested, noticing a stack of tapes on the shelf. Mrs. Donovan's face lit up. "Yes, I'd love that." Sarah set up the old VCR and inserted a tape, then sat beside Mrs. Donovan as the screen flickered to life. The video showed a young Emily's birthday party, her face beaming with joy as she blew out the candles on her cake. "Do you remember this day?" Mrs. Donovan asked, her voice filled with emotion. Sarah watched the screen, her heart swelling with the scenes of a happy family. "I do. It was a wonderful birthday." They watched the video in silence, the flickering images casting a nostalgic glow around the room. Sarah felt a deep sense of peace, knowing she had made a difference in Mrs. Donovan's life, even if only for a day. As the tape ended, Mrs. Donovan turned to Sarah, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Emily. You've given me the greatest gift." Sarah squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of emotion. "You're welcome, Mom." The room grew quiet, the weight of the day settling over them. Sarah stayed by Mrs. Donovan's side until she drifted off to sleep, her heart full of love and compassion. She knew that this day, like the one before, would stay with her forever, a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the importance of human connection. Walking down the silent corridor that night, Sarah felt a profound sense of fulfillment and peace. She whispered a silent promise to herself, to always cherish the connections that mattered most and to never underestimate the power of compassion and understanding. The next morning, Sarah walked into Mrs. Donovan's room with a sense of anticipation and trepidation. The previous day had been filled with emotional highs and intimate moments, and she wasn't sure what to expect today. As she entered, she found Mrs. Donovan already awake, gazing out the window with a thoughtful expression. "Good morning, Emily," Mrs. Donovan greeted her, a smile touching her lips as she turned to face Sarah. "Good morning, Mom," Sarah replied, the words flowing more naturally now. She moved to the bedside, taking Mrs. Donovan's hand. "Did you sleep well?" "As well as I could," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice soft. "I was thinking about our talk yesterday, about the past." Sarah nodded, sensing the gravity of the conversation about to unfold. She pulled up a chair and sat down, ready to listen. "Emily," Mrs. Donovan began, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination, "there are things I need to tell you, things I've kept inside for too long. You deserve to know the truth about why we drifted apart." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure she was prepared for this, but she knew it was important for Mrs. Donovan to share her story. "I'm here, Mom. You can tell me anything." Mrs. Donovan took a deep breath, her eyes distant as she recalled the past. "When your father passed away, I was devastated. He was my rock, my anchor, and suddenly he was gone. I felt lost, and I threw myself into my work to cope with the pain. I thought if I could just keep busy, I wouldn't have to face the grief." Sarah nodded, listening intently as Mrs. Donovan continued. "But in doing so, I neglected you," Mrs. Donovan admitted, her voice breaking. "I was so consumed by my own sorrow that I didn't see how much you needed me. You were hurting too, and I wasn't there for you. I'm so sorry, Emily." Sarah reached out, squeezing Mrs. Donovan's hand. "I understand, Mom. It must have been so hard for you." Mrs. Donovan's eyes filled with tears. "It was. But that's no excuse for how I treated you. You deserved better. You needed a mother, and I failed you." Sarah's heart ached for the pain and regret in Mrs. Donovan's voice. "We all make mistakes, Mom. What matters is that we're here now, and we can make things right." Mrs. Donovan nodded, wiping her eyes. "You're right. And there's more I need to tell you." Sarah waited, her heart pounding. "There was a man," Mrs. Donovan said softly. "A colleague. I thought he could fill the void your father left, but it was a mistake. He wasn't a good man, and he caused a lot of pain. You saw me with him, and you were so hurt. I didn't realize the impact it had on you until it was too late." Sarah felt a surge of emotion. She could imagine the confusion and betrayal Emily must have felt. I remember feeling so lost, like I didn't know who you were anymore." "I know," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice filled with regret. "I was blinded by my own desperation. When you left, I was heartbroken, but I understood why you had to go. I wanted to reach out, to apologize, but I was too ashamed." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years of misunderstanding and hurt. "I'm here now, Mom. And I forgive you. We can start over." Mrs. Donovan's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Emily. That means more to me than you'll ever know." The day continued with a sense of renewed connection between them. Sarah helped Mrs. Donovan with her morning routine, and they shared breakfast together, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in years. After breakfast, they decided to go through more photo albums. Mrs. Donovan seemed eager to share more memories, and Sarah was equally eager to learn. "This was our trip to Paris," Mrs. Donovan said, pointing to a photo of a young Emily standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, her face beaming with excitement. "You were so excited to see the City of Lights. It was one of the happiest trips we ever took." Sarah smiled, imagining the wonder and joy Emily must have felt. "It looks like an amazing trip." "It was," Mrs. Donovan agreed, her eyes sparkling with the memory. "We visited the Louvre, ate at little cafes, and wandered through the streets, just taking in the beauty of the city." Sarah could see the love and pride in Mrs. Donovan's eyes as she spoke of Emily. It was clear that despite the mistakes and misunderstandings, there had always been a deep bond between them. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Mrs. Donovan took another walk in the hospital garden. The flowers were in full bloom, the vibrant colors and fragrant scents creating a serene atmosphere. As they strolled along the winding paths, Mrs. Donovan seemed lost in thought. Sarah stayed close, ready to offer support if needed. "You know, Emily," Mrs. Donovan said after a while, her voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about our time together. These past few days have been more healing than I ever imagined." Sarah smiled, feeling a warm glow in her chest. "I'm glad to hear that, Mom. It's been a special time for me too." Mrs. Donovan nodded, her eyes reflecting a sense of peace. "I feel like I've been given a second chance to make things right, and I'm so grateful for that." They continued their walk in silence, the gentle rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds providing a soothing backdrop. As they reached a bench, Sarah suggested they sit for a while. "Do you remember the swing set we had in our backyard?" Mrs. Donovan asked, a wistful smile on her face. "You used to spend hours there, swinging so high I thought you'd touch the sky." Sarah laughed softly, imagining a young Emily with wind in her hair and joy in her heart. "I remember. It was one of my favorite places." Mrs. Donovan's eyes sparkled with the memory. "You always loved the simple things, Emily. You had a way of finding joy in the little moments." Sarah felt a surge of emotion, grateful for the opportunity to bring some happiness to Mrs. Donovan's life. "I think you taught me that, Mom." Mrs. Donovan smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Emily, for everything." As evening approached, they returned to Mrs. Donovan's room. The setting sun cast a golden glow through the window, creating a warm and comforting atmosphere. Sarah helped Mrs. Donovan settle into bed, making sure she was comfortable. "Would you like to watch another home video?" Sarah asked, noticing the stack of tapes on the shelf. Mrs. Donovan nodded, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Yes, I'd love that." Sarah set up the VCR and inserted a tape, then sat beside Mrs. Donovan as the screen flickered to life. This video showed a family picnic, with Emily running around, laughing and playing with her friends. "You always loved picnics," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice filled with fondness. "You'd run around all day, and by the time we got home, you'd be exhausted but happy." Sarah watched the screen, her heart swelling with the scenes of a happy family. "It looks like we had a lot of fun." "We did," Mrs. Donovan agreed, her eyes misty with tears. "Those were some of the best days of my life." As the video played on, showing scenes of laughter and love, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that these moments, these memories, were what truly mattered. Later that night, after Mrs. Donovan had fallen asleep, Sarah sat by her bedside, reflecting on the day. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing she had helped Mrs. Donovan find a measure of peace and closure. As she left the room and walked down the silent corridor, Sarah whispered a silent promise to herself, to always cherish the connections that mattered most and to never underestimate the power of compassion and understanding. The past few days had been a journey of healing and reconciliation, not just for Mrs. Donovan, but for Sarah as well. She had learned the importance of forgiveness, the power of love, and the value of human connection. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with a heart full of compassion and a spirit determined to make a difference in the lives of those around her. The morning air was crisp as Sarah made her way to Mrs. Donovan's room, a sense of calm determination guiding her steps. The past few days had been transformative, not only for Mrs. Donovan but also for Sarah. She knew today would be different, special, in a way that words could scarcely capture. As she entered the room, she found Mrs. Donovan looking out the window, a soft smile on her face. "Good morning, Emily," Mrs. Donovan greeted, her voice gentle and warm. "Good morning, Mom," Sarah replied, feeling a deep connection to the woman who had entrusted her with such a profound role. She sat by the bedside, taking Mrs. Donovan's hand in hers. "How are you feeling today?" "A bit tired," Mrs. Donovan admitted, her eyes showing a hint of fatigue. "But I'm happy. These past few days have been a gift." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "I'm glad to hear that. Would you like to go through more of the photo albums today, or maybe do something different?" Mrs. Donovan thought for a moment, her gaze drifting to the letter they had written to the real Emily. "I'd like to send the letter. It's important that she knows how I feel." Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of this final act. "I'll make sure it gets to her." After breakfast, Sarah helped Mrs. Donovan into a comfortable chair by the window. The sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow over the room. They spent the morning talking about Emily's childhood, reminiscing about the little moments that had brought them joy. "Do you remember the time we baked cookies together?" Mrs. Donovan asked, a twinkle in her eye. "You were so determined to make them perfect, but we ended up with a kitchen covered in flour." Sarah laughed, the image vivid in her mind. "I remember. It was a mess, but the cookies turned out delicious." Mrs. Donovan smiled, her eyes misty with tears. "Those were the best times, Emily. Just being together, sharing those simple joys." They continued sharing memories, each one a thread in the tapestry of their lives. As the day wore on, Sarah felt a growing sense of urgency. She knew Mrs. Donovan's time was limited, and she wanted to make every moment count. In the afternoon, Sarah suggested they watch another home video. Mrs. Donovan agreed, and Sarah set up the VCR, choosing a tape from the stack. The screen flickered to life, showing a family Christmas celebration. Emily, barely able to contain her excitement, was opening presents, her face lit up with pure joy. "Christmas was always your favorite holiday," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice filled with warmth. "You loved everything about it, the decorations, the music, the magic of it all." Sarah watched the screen, her heart swelling with emotion. "I still love Christmas. It's a time for family and love." Mrs. Donovan nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen. "I wish we had more Christmases together. But I'm grateful for the ones we had." As the video played on, showing scenes of laughter and love, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that these moments, these memories, were what truly mattered. As evening approached, Sarah helped Mrs. Donovan back into bed. The setting sun cast a golden glow through the window, creating a serene and comforting atmosphere. Sarah sat by the bedside, holding Mrs. Donovan's hand as they talked. "Emily," Mrs. Donovan began, her voice weak but filled with emotion, "I want you to know that you've made these last days of my life so beautiful. You've given me a chance to say the things I needed to say, to feel the love I thought I'd lost." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "It's been an honor, Mom. I'm so glad I could be here with you." Mrs. Donovan's grip tightened on Sarah's hand. "Promise me you'll live your life to the fullest, that you'll cherish every moment with the people you love." "I promise," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'll never forget what you've taught me." Mrs. Donovan smiled, a peaceful expression settling on her face. "Thank you, Emily, for everything." That night, Mrs. Donovan's health began to rapidly decline. Sarah stayed by her side, holding her hand and offering words of comfort. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the machines and the gentle sound of their breathing. "Emily," Mrs. Donovan whispered, her voice barely audible, "I love you." "I love you too, Mom," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. She knew these were their final moments together, and she wanted to make sure Mrs. Donovan felt loved and cherished. As the night wore on, Mrs. Donovan's breaths became shallower. Sarah held her hand tightly, her heart breaking at the thought of losing the woman who had become so dear to her. In her final moments, Mrs. Donovan looked at Sarah, a serene smile on her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and peace. And then, with a final, gentle breath, Mrs. Donovan passed away, her hands still clasped in Sarah's. The next morning, Emily arrived at the hospital, her face pale and drawn with worry. Sarah met her in the hallway, the letter clutched in her hand. "Emily?" Sarah said softly, approaching her. Emily looked up, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Yes?" Sarah handed her the letter, her heart pounding. "This is from your mother. She wanted you to have it." Emily took the letter, her hands trembling as she opened it. As she read, tears streamed down her face, and she let out a soft sob. "I'm so sorry," Emily whispered, her voice filled with regret. "I should have come sooner." Sarah placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She loved you very much, Emily. She understood, and she forgave you." Emily nodded, clutching the letter to her chest. "Thank you for being there for her." "It was my honor," Sarah replied, her voice filled with sincerity. At Mrs. Donovan's graveside, Emily stood with Sarah by her side. The letter had brought Emily a measure of peace, and she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. As the minister spoke words of comfort, Emily looked at Sarah, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," Emily said softly, "for everything." Sarah nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "You're welcome, Emily. Your mother loved you very much." As the service ended, they walked away from the grave, the sun shining brightly overhead. Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to honor her mother's memory by living her life to the fullest. And as Sarah watched her go, she felt a profound sense of peace, knowing she had made a difference in the lives of both Mrs. Donovan and Emily.